Classic WoW has a side to it that we've never seen, from scrap zones to remove dungeons, unfinished quest lines, and so much more. When Blizzard set out to make Classic originally, there was such a large volume of content built up that they wanted to put in the game, they physically did not have time to get it all done. The level cap was supposed to be 70, Northrend was seen on early versions of the map, and the Black Temple was even originally a dungeon, amongst many other things. Eventually though, it was packaged together into whole expansions rather than just continuing on patch by patch, and that's become the way Blizzard have done major gameplay updates ever since. Vanilla was really unique in this regard because at its outset it was the only version of WoW which really would have made sense if it just did continue through patches instead of your standard expansion with its whole new zones, raids, quests and so on. Currently in the classic WoW space, a lot of people are looking for a bit of vanilla action, be it a fresh, a seasonal, or something with a twist on the original experience. So I thought, why not highlight just how much of vanilla was not finished, and ask what if we never did get expansions, what content was cut or moved back, and what is the side of vanilla which we never really got to see. I want to start off on some loose ends that vanilla has, things which were started and not finished until in some cases years later. One of the more interesting ones, and a questline which is really easy to miss following through fully, starts right at the end of Uldum. You know the deal, you beat Arcades, who is about 5 levels higher than anything else in the dungeon because classic dungeon design, the rogue in the party loots the chest before anyone has a chance to say anything, and then you go click the large discs at the back of the room and start the quest, the Platinum Discs. This has you take your discovery back to either Ironforge or Thunderbluff, which will give a follow-up reward with some potions and a nice 14 slot bag too. But that is not where this questline ends. The bit people often miss is this unlocks a new quest which you are not directed to in any way because classic quest design, called Portents of Uldum. Your faction historians have found that there may be a link between these discs you found in Uldum and a mysterious gate on the southern end of Tanaris, and they want you to take those discs there and just see what happens. Upon arrival, a pedestal sits outside of the gate. When activated, it states the player must also have the Plates of Uldum before access can be granted, and since, well, you don't have them, it's back to your faction's capitals to report on this, with the quest ominously ending saying, "Be sure to check back with us soon. Uldum beckons." In reality, it was not beckoning very hard, as this is where the quest ended, and Uldum as a zone would not officially release in World of Warcraft until Cataclysm dropped some 6 years later. You can still see loads of comments from players who were wondering where this story would go after having finished it. Also, I was curious, so I went and had a look for the discs of Uldum in-game as a physical item, and I could not find them referenced anywhere. There's only replica discs that were added as a trash item when Uldum as a zone was revisited during 8.3 in BFA. I guess for Kata, Deathwing just kind of blew the gate off or something. That sounds lore friendly enough to me. Maybe there could be a way to obtain these discs of Uldum in vanilla, like some kind of attunement, and then open Uldum as a new late game vanilla zone. Speaking of quest chains that ended rather abruptly, there is another big one that so many people will have done and very few ever ended up following through. So after battling through hordes of undead trolls, solving puzzles, and reminding your group to kill every dragon mob in sight, you eventually make it to the final boss of the Sunken Temple, the Shade of Aranicus. It can be a bit of a tricky fight due to his level and spamming CC, but once he's down you get the Chained Essence of Aranicus, a trinket that poisons enemies in a small area around you, which is okay. It can be useful in AoE pulls and for debuffing rogues in PvP so they can't constantly re-stealth. What you also get here is a start of a quest to go and speak to Itharius, who is using the amazingly scuffed old High Elf model. To proceed further, however, you have to hand in your Chained Essence trinket to the quest giver, which can seem like a pretty big price when half-decent trinkets are just kinda, well, non-existent in Classic for the most part. This then has a follow-up where you have to journey across land and sea to the faraway Winterspring to talk to Umbrance the Spirit Speaker, where the quest just randomly ends. There isn't even a mysterious cliffhanger, it's just straight up not finished. In fact, the quest makes it sound like you're going to need to collect some object for the Spirit Speaker to allow him to contact and help Aranicus. I even found a comment on Wowhead quoting a blue post on this premature quest ending, saying more will be added to the Aranicus quest chain in a future patch. I can't reveal anything further at this time, but from what I've seen, it's going to be really cool and fairly rewarding. Or neither of the above. I have a feeling this could have been linked into the Emerald Dream storyline, which we can talk about later, that was also not finished during vanilla. Similar to Uldum, this could serve as a point to pick up an interesting storyline for players to explore, or at least finish a quest line and add in some kind of other reward since you had to give in your trinket for a bit of XP and gold. One more quest related one now, or I guess more of a reputation grind. So far north in Winterspring are the creatively named Winterspring Trainers, which consist of one night elf chilling, quite literally, on top of a rock. Farming rep through repeatable quests with this one-man faction will eventually unlock the Winterspring Frost Saber, a unique recolor of this mount so you can stand out a little bit in the crowd. However, it being a night elf, it's gonna be alliance only. But what if I told you the Horde was supposed to have their own counterpart to this quest in vanilla too? Because I'm pretty sure that they did, but it just never got finished. In Ungoro Crater, there are two NPCs, one to the southeast and one to the northwest, who are part of the Ravasor Trainers. Both of these were removed at the start of TBC, but in Wrath you can head over to Morvek in the southeast and start to learn how to tame and eventually own your own Venomhide Ravasor. These quests are really just for the completionist who want an excuse to play the game more and chase a hard mount, but it would be a pretty easy thing to add into vanilla to mirror a piece of content which ended up being alliance only. A much bigger part of the game next, and one that underwent many changes from alpha to release in vanilla, those being the NPC and character models that we used in the game. I read online now and again that some people are interested in using updated models in vanilla, but what if we went the other way instead and brought back more usage of the older alpha models? Now, to be fair, they are used now and again. In the Dead Mines, the Defias miners are using the old human worker variants, and Defias ambushers can spawn as part of an event just outside of Stormwind. These guys have a more thin, roguey type appearance. Certain South Sea pirates also use old models too. There's actually plenty of examples that made it into the live game. But do you remember the old character models that there used to be? Some really didn't undergo too many changes, such as Night Elf or Tauren. Others, however, like Early Undead or the infamous female troll, are a little bit different from the end result. When you see some of these old models, you do start to realize why Blizzard in some cases decided that they would be better off canning them rather than trying to shoehorn them into the game somewhere. But perhaps it could be a bit more variety to character customization, add something to the appearances we are used to, or just to throw some of the questionable models back into the game as NPCs or enemies. But the area where the most content didn't make it into the game compared to how much was planned has to be zones. Which is crazy if you think about it, because vanilla is by a huge margin the largest version of WoW ever. Among the capitals of Azeroth, the one that perhaps underwent the most changes was Ironforge. Alpha Ironforge was very different to the end result that we got on launch, with far more narrow pathways throughout the city, bridges all over the place on upper levels to support houses and stores, and the central Great Forge was, well, a lot more forgy as opposed to the huge pool of lava that we have now. Comparatively, Ironforge these days is a lot more open and has more of a grand and majestic feeling to it, as opposed to a more dark and gritty dwarven city. Explorers over the years in World of Warcraft have also shown off Old Ironforge, or the Hall of Thanes, an unused location underneath Ironforge that was present in game files and can still be explored to this day if you know how to click through the wall. This location was later used in the 4.1 PTR during Cataclysm as a return to this particular area to give players an official chance to see what had been lurking below for all this time. Next up, Ashara. It always felt like a zone which was lacking on content. Aside from a couple quests specific to the Horde Alliance, a location for plenty of the Sunken Temple class quests, and the incredibly inconveniently located Duke Hydraxis, there ain't all that much there, and there's quite likely some good reasons for that, because content was planned for Ashara, but it just didn't end up happening. There are two major things that we know about, both of which ended up getting scrapped. The Ashara Crater Battleground. This was going to be another PvP addition to the game with a more Dota or MOBA gameplay theme to it. Though how that would have worked in an MMO, I'm not entirely sure, but if Blizzard did do it then, there would have been a very early adopter to the third-person MOBA. This Battleground idea was in consideration as early as patch 1.3, and would be a repeat topic for Blizzard during Wrath, and was even brought up for Mists of Pandaria. Unfortunately, it fell to the wayside and never came to the light, and has been sitting out as a missing piece of content ever since. These days, I think having a MOBA type battleground in an MMO when the MOBA genre has existed for so many years now and is well established might be a bit of a tough sell. Another major piece of content was the Bay of Storms instance, with many screenshots online of a placeholder portal being in the vanilla beta for this. Back then, every single instance portal looked like the Dark Portal, by the way. Very little is known about what this sub-zone could have held. Was it going to be a dungeon? Was it going to be a raid? Was it going to be underwater? Would it have made Ashara more of an active zone? Probably. If I can say one thing about Ashara though, it's maybe that Blizzard did not want it to be seen. It's a very beautiful zone when you're flying above it, but for a game with no flying mounts, the way the zone is set out can be very frustrating when you're either doing some Olympic length swim to get between quests, or trying not to fall off a cliff to your doom. Grim Batol is another subzone with an interesting story that could be realised in the game. As a short rundown of one of the stories that's happened there, it was once home to the Dragonmaw clan, where Alexstrasza was held captive. Grim Batol served as a base of operations, where the Orcs aimed to raise a secret army to lay waste to the Alliance. However, an unlikely force led by Ronin managed to free her, where she went on to destroy the remainder of the Dragonmaw clan. Now, we don't need to copy-paste the storyline. Maybe having Alexstrasza being held captive in Classic sounds like a little bit much, but a mid-level dungeon involving the Dragonmaw in the wetlands, that could work. There aren't exactly a ton of dungeons around that area, and it would be very much in line with an existing enemy already found in that zone. Of course, during the Cataclysm, Grim Batol would be brought back and finally revealed as a dungeon, where thematically you ride a dragon in at the start and destroy most of the trash as you begin. Moving on though, the Hellfire Peninsula was also in development during Vanilla, though would only go on to be released during TBC. It was expected to be a later game zone, and from looking at it, it's quite reminiscent of its end result. Early versions had way more items flying in the air though, similar to how Nagrand ended up being. I think putting Hellfire in Vanilla would be difficult though. It's kind of inexorably linked to the idea of going through the Dark Portal, and once you cross that threshold, well, surely it has to be a lot more than just one new zone, especially when that zone isn't hugely different from what ends up being playable in the expansion. Another piece of TBC content present in Vanilla was the Caverns of Time, located in eastern Tanaris. Through some creative wall jumping, you can get in there, and, well, it's basically exactly what shipped alongside TBC. Caverns of Time has always been a very intriguing place. Whenever there's a need to put something in the game which doesn't really fit with the timeline, just throw it in the Caverns of Time, say it's magic, bronze dragonflight, job done. From the culling of Stratholme, the battle for Mount Hyjal, to the Dragon Soul, and many more. This place has allowed for the WoW devs to tell many stories from the past all over again. Again, not really sure how much it fits into Vanilla and to what extent it could be used, but if it was, well, Warcraft 3 certainly has enough story packed into it to make many instances off of. One of World of Warcraft's most famous raids ever surely would deserve a chance for a reboot in some format or another. I mean, beyond Vanilla, it's both a raid in TBC and a two-part dungeon in Legion. I'm of course talking about Kazan. From World of Warcraft's alpha and beta, work was already put into this location, with room after room being sculpted out, though it was definitely in need of a lot more work. There are also the crypts below, which have been explorable for a very long time, but again, they were never used in the actual game until, I believe, Legion for certain artifact weapons such as the Moonkin's Scythe of Elune. Kazan is a mysterious and magical location though. More or less anything could go here in regards to it being a dungeon or a piece of raiding content. Maybe you even have it be a zone where the inside of the tower is considerably larger than it appears from the outside. You can always just say it's magic, right? As mentioned earlier, the Emerald Dream has had frequent mentions throughout the Warcraft universe. In Night Elf questing, Moonglade, Druid questing, as well as the huge physical portals that the Green Dragon world bosses guard scattered across the world. The closest we've gotten to an Emerald Dream in World of Warcraft was the somewhat disappointing opening raid of Legion, the Emerald Nightmare. The only legacy that left behind was it being one of, if not the easiest mythic raids of all time. It was cleared in a bit over 12 hours on its opening day. Didn't make for much of a world first race, that one. I will say, after having defeated Xavius, the area afterwards was a nice look into how the dream would have been. For Classic, there was technically an Emerald Dream in the game files, which as you can imagine was huge, open, expansive fields, alien plants, and colossal trees on a seemingly endless scale, though it just never quite found its way into being a completed idea, even though it was indicated at an early stage that a lot of work had gone into it, with Jeff Kaplan being quoted as saying, "The Emerald Dream is shaping up to be extremely cool. We don't want to preview any of the content yet, as it is endgame, and we want some surprises for players. The zone is massive and beautiful, and once the content team is done with it, it will be exceedingly challenging." It almost sounds as though there was a lot more done than just a level design here. Maybe what they cooked up back then was used in a future expansion in a not so obvious way. That tends to be the case. Speaking of content used in a future expansion, the World of Warcraft team at one point were very much considering player housing. Housing had been a feature of many of the successful predecessors to World of Warcraft, such as Star Wars Galaxy or Ultima Online, and well, Blizzard weren't exactly out to redesign the wheel with World of Warcraft now, were they? From the very outset of World of Warcraft, giving players the ability to create their own home was something under consideration. It just never took that top priority spot to really be worked on over other features for such a long time, yet remnants of it remain in the game, such as the portal behind a portcullis in Stormwind. This was to be the entrance to the residential district. Eventually, I think we can say one of two things happened to housing in World of Warcraft. Either you see Warlords of Draenor's garrison system as it was certainly very ambitious, but often left players feeling as though they had a little reason to leave their own instance version of the world, as everything they needed was right there. More social or communal residence could have been interpreted from the class order halls of Legion. Mages got a tower of practice and learning, warriors got a glorious skybound arena, and rogues got a murky sewer. I'm surprised they haven't tried to bring order halls back already, to be honest. It could be a core expansion feature as far as I'm concerned. But we have never had housing as it's been seen in other games, as in a customizable building which enables you to choose things such as item placement, decoration, theme, and so on. I really don't know how housing would fit into Classic, whether it makes sense. There is kind of a nice thing about Stormwind, Ironforge, Orgrimmar, and so on being busy, and if you want something to be personal to the player, does it have to be separate? Maybe it just wasn't meant to be. It really is amazing just how much content was planned for vanilla, and to look back and see what was scrapped, what was unfinished, and what just needed a few more expansions to come to life. I think it goes without saying I've definitely been speculating from a Classic Plus angle on this video too, and I hope this shows how much extra stuff there possibly could be in Classic, whilst keeping things very true to how the game was back then. Imagine there is a certain item in World of Warcraft that quite literally everyone wants, but only players with a certain profession are able to gather, and even then it's impossibly rare. An item which is used in consumables that are disproportionately powerful and required if you really want to push performance in raiding. Well, back in Classic WoW there was such an item, and it was called the Black Lotus. Black Lotus were part of a number of important profession items too, such as the Gorobashi Mojo Madness. You needed this to spawn the extra boss in Zul'Gurub for the class trinkets, or the stealth enchant on cloaks, so rogues could be that little extra bit annoying, but their main use were for flasks. Now in, to be honest, every expansion since Classic, flasks have not been too much of a problem. They're not going to cost you the majority of your gold to get one or two of them, and there's a number of reasons why this happened. Top of the list is that the ingredients became significantly easier to obtain. You needed a lot less of them, as well as profession specializations allowing for extra crafts. None of this was the case in vanilla. Flasking in vanilla was a commitment, and it kind of had to be because these flasks were A, really hard to make, and B, really overpowered. Take Flask of Supreme Power for an example, as it was in vanilla, a 2-hour buff that gives 150 spell power. Now in TBC, Blizzard realized, these vanilla flasks are kind of really good, so they nerfed Supreme Power down from 150 spell power to 70. Then the new flasks in TBC, such as Flask of Pure Death, gave 80 spell power, and then Wrath came around where Flask of the Frostworm gives 125 spell power. So if we're comparing the unchanged version of each flask between each expansion, the vanilla flask that we were using at level 60 is 25 spell damage more powerful than the one that we're currently using at level 80. And in starter raid gear, a flask could legitimately contribute to about 30% or more of your total spell damage. And of course they lasted through death as well, no other consumable did this. It's a pretty similar story for all the other flasks, for all the other roles as well in vanilla. So Yeah, what I'm saying is these things are pretty overpowered. On top of that, you had to go to a special crafting table too in order to actually make them. It wasn't like it was in TBC where you had an alchemy table in Shattrath that was easy to get to, or Wrath where you can just make them anywhere. In Phase 1 of Classic, the only place in the game you could make flasks was Scholomance, not something a solo player could just hop in and do either. In Phase 2, there was an alchemy table added to Blackwing Lair just after Broodlord Lashalayer. It was even placed you could go and craft flasks whilst waiting for the Flame Buffet stacks to drop on the Firemaw encounter. Pretty convenient that you could do that. But the biggest hurdle was assembling the items. Flasks simply needed a huge amount of ingredients per one, each one requiring some 40 or so endgame herbs. Flask of the Titans, for example, that's the one that gave bonus health, needed 30 Grom's Blood, these are gathered from high level zones or dungeons, 10 Stone Scale Oil, these were from fishing, and 1 Black Lotus. In fact, every flask needed a Black Lotus, so how do we get to them? Well, step 1 is going to be going out there and grinding up to 300 herbalism. Only herbalists with a max skill could even pick these in the first place. And it's classic of course, so gathering attempts can fail. You could actually have clicked a Black Lotus herb, failed the attempt, and then somebody else comes along at the right time, clicks it before you do, and takes it under your nose. One of Classic's more rage-inducing moments, that's for sure. Though if I remember right, Tauren's plus 15 racial bonus to herbalism puts them over the failure threshold, so Tauren's OP I guess. Black Lotus could be found in 4 high-level zones, those being Winterspring, Silithus, the Burning Steppes, and the Eastern Plaguelands. Also back in Vanilla, they were their own gathering nodes. Lotus were not rare finds from other herbs as Fel Lotus worked in TBC or Frost Lotus in Wrath, and when I say they were rare, I mean it. Unless you were properly setting in for a several-hour-long herbalism session, the chance you came across one in the wild was incredibly low. The one time I saw a Black Lotus in literally the whole of Classic was having it spawn as we were running as a guild to Molten Core, and of course somebody instantly grabbed it. The reason why they're so rare is because only one could spawn at a time in those 4 aforementioned zones, and on top of that there were a good 24 or so spawn points in each of the zones. On top of that they had around a 1 hour respawn time each. Now in original Vanilla, sure Black Lotus were hard to get, but the concept of full consumes for raiding was just nowhere near as commonplace as it was when we did Classic. Whether it was lack of knowledge of what consumables stack, things working differently as they have progressive patches, or just the cost of flasking up, it was less of a thing. The top-end server capacity was much lower too. The player base was simply spread out across a greater number of servers. Blizzard posts from pre-Classic launch in 2019 say as much as well. Please also note that our realm population estimates of low, medium, high, and full are based on this increased capacity. A medium realm today already has more characters on it than even the most crowded realms did back in 2006. And its estimated vanilla servers capped out around 4,000 to 5,000 players, whereas in Classic the big servers were easily over 10k. That's a whole lot more people in one place. Add on top of this the fact that nowadays people min-max the game a lot more. They want to play the top DPS with the best gear and turn up for raids with the correct enchants, food, and of course consumables, including flasks. Sure, the content was easy back then, which is why people turned to competing for speed clears or for passing, and you didn't want to be the one guy who didn't turn up with flasks when everybody else did. That just wasn't a good look for you. So what happens when we put easily 3 to 4 times the player capacity onto vanilla realms alongside a player base that is much more predisposed to min-maxing? The demand for flasks, and therefore Black Lotus, absolutely skyrockets to unreasonably high levels. Keep in mind there's 4 Lotus spawning across 4 zones per hour. That's 96 Lotus per day per realm, which isn't even enough for 3 40-man raid teams to flask up. The big servers had thousands of people trying to raid on reset days, with data from sites such as Ironforge.pro showing easily above 250,000 active raiders on most weeks during Classic. This made Black Lotus into the hottest commodity in Classic WoW by a very long way. Players who leveled early could solo farm and reap the rewards of their no-lifing, whilst the price of this virtual herb started to gain significant interest from not so legitimate methods of farming, as well as those are looking to profit in the real world. And if Black Lotus were one thing, it was profitable. So to put things in perspective back then, gold was worth a lot more. These were fresh servers after all, there weren't daily quests, raw gold farms weren't as good, and only one class, the mage, could really access the best farming methods. I'd say that 1 gold back then in Classic is worth at least 10 now in Wrath. And I've got plenty of clips on the channel from back in the day between phases 1 and 2, a Black Lotus going for in excess of 200 gold, and the flasks themselves being near 230g or even more. Of course, things varied a lot here on where you played. I was on Gehennis at the time, which was a giga sweaty server, and therefore a giga expensive server. Other places had literally half the price, as you can see here. Imagine with 10 times inflation if your flasks for Nax 25 will cost you over 2,000 gold each. That's a pretty real way to think about how much these things were back then. And that's just for your flask, by the way. Nearly every consumable stack, because, you know, it's vanilla, remember? You could legit have about 24 different consumes for different occasions. Suffice to say, if you wanted to flask, you had to get out there and grind gold hard, or go farm them yourself. Neither option was without its own challenges. Early in Classic, for example, as a warlock, I went and farmed Eye of Shadow in Dark Whisper Gorge. It was a 1 in 100 drop chance and needed for priests to craft their benediction. You could get a few hundred gold for each of these drops. Later, after Diamor came out, I did Diamor East jump runs, mining the rich thorium veins at the end. They had a chance to drop an arcane crystal, which went for somewhere around 60 to 100 gold. Again, each server varied a lot here. But as a warlock, I had good options for farming. Other classes, as in everyone apart from mage to be honest, did not have things this good. Now you could always duo farm with somebody else, that was always a solid option, but then you need somebody else to be on, you have to split the gold, it can be inconvenient and so on and so forth, and people wanted to keep up, people wanted to flask, but actually going out there and farming in the open world was incredibly competitive for reasons we've already gone over, and as time went on, many people got tired with farming and looked to other sources to source their consumables. Early on in Classic, the black market for Black Lotus was booming. These are screenshots from April 2020, where one of these virtual herbs would set you back some $10, meaning a stack of Black Lotus had a pretty realistic real-world value of $200. The supply could barely match the demand, and do these prices ever show it? It's bad to me that people were willing to fork out this level of money for these items, but hey, you know what they say, time is money, friend. The relaunch of World of Warcraft had proven an extremely lucrative opportunity for gold farmers and botters, and they were fully dedicated to cornering off this market and driving prices as high as possible. If you controlled the majority of the daily 96 Lotus spawns on your realm, you could even hold stock back and create further demand for this item, and that is exactly what happened. How'd they do it? Well, there were a number of ways. First of all was establishing all these spawn locations. Thanks to the likes of add-ons, WoW heads, other server data, this was pretty fast to do. But then you have the problem of knowing where has the Lotus spawned. How can you know this without running laps of the zone and wasting a load of time? Pretty simple actually. The farmers would watch all of the Lotus spawns at the same time. Every single one. They would have level 1 characters come over to the spawns via summoning and have them die there. Then you have a ghost character watching the spawn all the time. If it spawns at that location, the herber for the zone comes along to pick it, and then you begin a timer with a pretty good idea of when to log in and next check that zone. A lot of herb mafias would come about because of this too, and on PvP servers, farmers would nearly always be able to outnumber a single player at any time of the day. I know some guilds that did this too as a bit of fun way to encourage some more PvP, and it was just a good gold farm as well. But for the average player who got on in the evening and had a couple hours to play, you were gonna seriously struggle to farm in the open world, let alone actually being able to see a single Black Lotus. It wasn't until May 2020 that Blizzard finally took action, and back then, them actually changing things was a pretty serious step. The whole no changes idea was still very strong, so for Blizzard to actively be rebalancing something in game was a big deal. This change, however, was pretty much unanimously fundamentally seen as something that would overwhelmingly benefit the majority of players. They say, since the launch of WoW Classic, the game has used the spawn times and locations from original World of Warcraft, but populations and social factors have led to Black Lotus being much more scarce than it was in original WoW. We're going to increase the spawn rate of Black Lotus, and we're going to add many additional spawn locations in each of the Black Lotus zones. With a different hotfix, we're working on making it so a player cannot see a Black Lotus on screen or on their minimap if they're dead, unless they have 300 herbalism. This one fell swoop of a change hit all the points that it needed to. Gold farmers couldn't camp level 1 corpses on spawn points anymore, and the availability of Black Lotus went up around 4 times or so. Player estimates following the update reckon that Lotus spawn timers went as low as 15 minutes, down from 1 hour, and there was now multiple different spawn timers per zone and a load more spawn locations. Though gold farmers still went after Lotus, there were just so many more now, casual players had a realistic chance to get them, and the prices on the auction house started to come down. I have some footage showing the massive rise in quantity on the auction house alongside a huge price drop just after this change was made across both EU and NA. There was definitely a knee-jerk reaction to this change, mainly because people were drip selling Lotus on the auction house and wanted to offload in case they crashed, but prices settled to more reasonable amounts. Though flasks were still around the 80 to 100 gold mark, it was a lot more attainable than they were going to be if they kept going up. In the Burning Crusade and Wrath, of course, the Lotus of the expansion are just rare drops from high-level herbs, and even in Season of Mastery, Blizzard made this change so Black Lotus would drop from high-level herbs too. Maybe that was just the sensible solution the whole time. But that's the story of the Black Lotus in Classic, and I don't think there's been something quite like it since. Maybe Darkmoon card greatness, that's kind of expensive to get early on in Wrath, but it's a one-time thing. You certainly aren't out there grinding gold weekly just to be able to raid anymore, that's for sure. It's one of the many things that made Classic an experience which is apart from other versions of World of Warcraft, and a special one at that. Getting into PvP in Wrath Classic is easy. You do some PvP, you earn honor, you go buy gear, and that is it. Job done. But it wasn't always quite so simple. I did a video recently with a throwback to all the effort that went into world buffs, and it seems to me like a lot of people are either new to Wrath or enjoyed remembering them. It got me thinking about another core feature of vanilla, which has never been recreated in any version of World of Warcraft since. Releasing early on into Classic, this system followed true to how it was originally implemented, and it was the start of what was, without a single doubt for me, the most try-hard and sweaty 2 months that Classic WoW has or ever will see. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the honor and ranking PvP system of Classic WoW. So first question, why rank? Why get into this? Why is it such a big deal? Well, the gear is really good. Ranks 7, 8 and 10 gave blue quality gear, which also had tier set bonuses tied to them that made them even better. Ranks 12 and 13 gave epic armor, and 14 gave weapons. These items were best in slot for months, in some cases for the entire game. The gear was absolutely amazing for all specs and classes, and for vanilla was very well itemized as well. It was also a guaranteed source of loot. Remember, vanilla had 40-man raids and bosses dropped about 4 or so items. Being on that wait list for your bis could take a very long time, especially when you're one of your guild's 10 warriors, which isn't really an exaggeration either. And finally, perhaps the biggest reason overall why it was so sweaty is because it was winter 2019, peak COVID, and you were probably working from home. The term COVID ranker was often used. Remember, in Wrath, it's just PvP, you get honor, buy gear. That's quite literally it. It doesn't need to be explained any further than that. Back in Classic, it was a little bit more complicated, shall we say. So essentially, you go do PvP, your open world, your battlegrounds, objectives, capping flags, and so on and so forth, and you earn honor. At the end of the week, on a server by server basis, this is important, the game checks who has earned the most honor and then awards ranking points based upon that. The player with the most honor of that week will earn a maximum of around 13,000 ranking points, with all other players in the PvP pool earning gradually less RP or ranking points corresponding to how much honor they farmed. And you needed a minimum of 15 honorable kills a week to be part of that week's PvP pool. This will be relevant later. Your total RP determines your rank. This will be the visible title you have, so rank 6 is Knight for Alliance, and rank 9 is Centurion for Horde, and so on. Your rank is also what permits you to access PvP rewards. Rank 11 gives mounts, rank 12 and 13 the epic armor, and so on. All of these rewards are bought for gold, by the way. Honor is just a resource used to calculate RP, not a currency. To achieve rank 14, the highest possible rank, you needed a total of 60k ranking points. And as you can earn around 13,000 per week maximum, it doesn't sound all too bad of a grind, right? Well, actually no, that would be quite wrong. You see, you lose 20% of your RP each week. This is called decay, and decay is the real kicker in this system, because as your rank goes up, your RP total does too, and you keep losing more and more each week. So once you start ranking with a goal rank in mind, you can't stop, or decay will wipe out potentially weeks worth of progression with this system. You can't have a week off ranking, you can't miss a day, you can't abandon the grind, or it will all have been for nothing. And yes, you can lose ranks through decay. In fact, in the final weeks from 13 to 14, your RP earnings will only be a little higher than the decay of your overall rank. And when I say 13,000 RP is the maximum earned, you have to be in the top 0.2% of the players for honor games that week to be around that level. It used to be 0.1% too, but believe it or not, we had the more lenient version of classic ranking. So being, for example, in the top 2% of honor gained for that week would not have been good enough to reach rank 14. Your decay would be too high and it would not be possible. You had to be right at the top, grinding for hours and hours every day. On top of that, each rank advancement, as you can see here, is 5k RP over the last one. This means if you miss out on some grind, you could very much end up at, for example, rank 13, 95% progress, meaning despite only being 5% off your goal, you had to go and grind honor for another over 12 hours a day for a whole week in order to beat decay. And when I say 12 hours a day, that's casual talk, and I'm being totally serious. The hours required to invest in ranking was absolutely obscene. It was more than a game, it was more than a job. It was living and breathing for several months on Discord with other people insane enough to do this. And the likes of Discord and real life communication were totally key to ranking. Early on in Classic, you had to play ball to get ranks. If you didn't know the right people, you just weren't going to get a high rank. That was it. Remember, all this ranking stuff is server specific. The top honor earners will get the most RP, and the most RP gets you your rank the fastest. You see where this is going yet? So on each server, people began creating honor caps, or began to talk about being capped for the week. Now, there was no cap to how much honor you could gain in each week, of course. You could farm as much as you wanted, but people, well, didn't want to PvP more than they had to. And the term PvP being used for ranking was, it was farming, pure and simple. PvP was the side event. It was all about the grind. More on that later. Now, you needed to set the honor cap high enough when no casual player could possibly have any effect on it, nor could anyone not part of the ranking group realistically have a chance to farm enough to disrupt it. This varied server to server. Early on during my time on Gehennas, which was without a doubt the sweatiest European server, the launch caps when battlegrounds finally came out were in excess of 1.5 million honor gained in the space of a week. You got a couple thousand per battleground, by the way. The second thing setting a cap to honor did was allowing people to bracket stack. As ranking point awards, remember, are done off a percentage of total players within the pool. You wanted as many people as possible to be as close together as possible to min-max your RP earnings. This system was good when everyone worked together and stuck to the amount of honor they were assigned to farm. Yes, people were assigned a number of honor to farm in a week, but what if somebody went a bit rogue towards the end of the week and began to PvP more and gained extra honor? That was a big no-no. We don't want to PvP, remember, we want to earn ranking points. Doing this was called bracket breaking and was one of the most potentially dramatic things you could do in a ranking environment. Accidental or otherwise, and you bet people did this on purpose, after PvPing for 16 to 18 hours a day for months, yes, it was months to get rank 14, a lot of people went over the edge a bit, shall we say. Anyways, by raising the honor cap, you could easily throw off the calculations for the week, as it was a matter of tenths of a percentage. It was very easy to do, especially at the top of the bracket. It literally gained you nothing as you were already among the top earners, whilst also more or less ensuring that everyone else at the top just got another week of 16-hour battlegrounds added to their life. If there was ever a way to get back at someone though, this was it. So yeah, pretty simple system so far. Can't see why they ended up changing it to just go earn honor and buy gear. But wait, There's a lot more actually. This is where we need to talk about the PvP pool. This is the total number of players who have gained 15 or more honorable kills in a week. Now, of course, ranking point gains are done from a percentage of the total players in the PvP pool, and we know that players were trying to stack the bracket to min-max their gains here. In fact, on smaller servers, sometimes the PvP pool was not large enough to award the highest amount of RP gains, and you literally could not get rank 14 because decay was too high. Ideally though, you wanted the PvP pool to be as large as possible. More participants opened up new slots at the top end for people to earn more RP, and as far as I remember, adding around 330 extra characters to the PvP pool added an extra bracket 1 spot. So how do you convince 330-ish people to go and get 15 honorable kills? Well, you could always just do it yourself. People really try-harding ranking would organize pool boosting. This involved creating level 1 characters, running them to the nearest graveyard, and having them farm an enemy faction character 15 times over. When they have 15 honorable kills, you delete the character, you run a new one over, and you repeat. Yes, deleted characters did count towards the PvP pool, and yes, people really did this a lot. In fact, people ended up botting it. There are some pretty insane clips out there back from Classic of dwarves gracefully flying out of the starting zone to do some good old-fashioned pool boosting. And I've just realized I haven't even mentioned what an honorable kill is yet either. How did I make it this far? It's simple. Any character within a range of 12 levels of you will grant honor, increased by their rank, decreased by how many times they've been farmed on that particular day. This meant as a level 60, it's very honorable to go and delete a level 48 from existence for some of those sweet honor points. But there are dishonorable kills too. You have to be really careful about these. There are NPCs throughout the game who are marked as civilians. Killing these will instantly lower your rank. This was added more or less just to stop griefing and people camping NPCs, and dishonorable kills lowered your rank fast, and I mean fast. You could wipe out months worth of 16-hour days in about 2 hours or so. This meant when you were ranking, you actually didn't want to go anywhere near a place that had NPCs marked as civilian just in case it happened somehow. You could even get dishonorable kills as part of a group too without actually having done anything yourself. But when ranking launched, you kinda had to take the fight to the opposite faction. See, back in original vanilla, when this PvP system launched, it did so without any battlegrounds being available, and in Classic, yep, we went ahead and did the exact same thing. No changes. So we're talking about a PvP system which actively encourages playing for over 12 hours a day, grouping up into pre-mades, ganking lobbies at the peak of COVID and working from home, combined with a generation of gamers who missed the boat on rank 14 the first time around. And what you get out of that? You get Phase 2 Classic World of Warcraft PvP. World PvP. And oh boy, was it definitely one of the most things that happened during Classic. Credit where it's due here, Terra Mill versus South Shore for a couple of days was actually a lot of fun, but it quickly descended into camping and farming lower level characters, and you better hope you were level capped if you were on a PvP server, because leveling was just off limits now. If you were a faction minority on a server, this was even worse. Remember, if you're level 48 or above, you give honor. There were ganking trains from Thorium Point to Blackrock Mountain, littered with the bodies of the poor unfortunates who made up the faction minority on their server. Any end game zone was now an honor farming zone. One time on a journey from Feathermoon Stronghold to Diamol East on my Warlock, I died a total of 9 times. It's like driving down a highway and you get stopped to pay a toll every few hundred meters, except the toll was, without exception, either an orc warrior with a shaman or an undead rogue and priest, waiting to claim their 198 honor. Split 2 ways, of course. Transport between continents was off limits too. Horde controlled the seas like a bunch of pirates, but Alliance couldn't farm on the Horde Zeppelins because obviously Horde transport had guards and Alliance ships didn't. Blizzard, thanks for that. Even faction capitals were not safe. You had to farm harder and longer if you wanted to rank up. It wasn't a choice. Rogues would roam the streets of Ironforge looking to pick off those who strayed too far from the guards, and mages would res, pyro some poor unfortunate undergear lobby and then die themselves and run back. And they did this all day, every day, for weeks. Some servers saw their faction totally die off during this phase of the game as the ganking was so unrelenting. And so eventually, earlier than expected, Blizzard brought Battlegrounds back to Classic. The first two we had were Warsong Gulch and Alterac Valley. Now initially Warsong just wasn't played at all. Why? Bad honor per hour, of course. Keep your eyes on the goal, we're not here to have fun. Alterac Valley, or AV, however, presented the best honor per hour in the game, and you know how people played AV back in Classic? A battleground that had a legacy of games lasting for hours and hours or even days, and a constant tug of war back between the Horde and the Alliance. They ran straight past each other down to the enemy general in a bid to finish the map the fastest. The best honor per hour was running down Alterac Valley for 16 hours a day doing PvE, and I'm not exaggerating. And players had honor farming min-maxed down to a T. So interestingly, here was where the Alliance did have a benefit over the Horde. Many more PvP oriented players went Horde due to the fact they had some really busted racials back then, such as WillE the Forsaken or Hardiness. But when it came to joining a queue for Battlegrounds, the Horde were nearly always waiting. Even an Alterac Valley at launch was a good 20 minutes or so, and later on into the expansion, it was legitimately hours of waiting. Alliance pressed join Battleground and the queue popped up instantly every single time. Now back then, if you remember, Battlegrounds had a number assigned to them, and you could see on your pop-up which Battleground number you had received. And whilst you couldn't just full on queue as a 40-man for Alterac Valley, you could game the system into essentially guaranteeing that you're going to win. Get ready for this one. So what players did is they had a ranking Discord server. As we went over earlier, communication between players is key to getting the most out of your ranking. What would happen is that a bot on Discord would count down for everybody to press join Battleground at the same time. After a few seconds, everyone posts what Battleground number they've received in the Discord chat. The bot would then tally up how many instances of each Battleground had been entered. So if you only got 5 people with the same Battleground number, that's no good. Drop that queue, rejoin the next countdown, and try again. Of course, you don't get any punishment for dropping the queue. However, if you, for example, got 25 people in the same Alterac Valley, this happened regularly by the way, everyone presses join and you have an AV with over half your team on comms, with some of the best gear available, rocking consumables, and of course having engineering. The Horde just didn't have even a remote chance when they ran into a pre-made like this, and they often had to wait close to an hour for Alterac Valleys which could finish in, again no exaggeration, as little as 8 minutes. Oh, and the Horde had to resort to joining an AV queue, flying over to Eastern Plaguelands to gank low-level Alliance players, finally getting a Battleground queue, you play it out, your BG ends, it puts you back to where you joined the BG, you rejoin, and then you fly back to EPL. People used Undercity because it was closest to an endgame level zone. Sounds like fun, right? Later on, Blizzard removed the ability to see a Battleground number in queue, but players found ways around it though, and kept premades going right up to the end of Classic. I could do a whole video on the shifting Alterac Valley meta, but yeah, it was pretty sweaty to say the least. Warsong Gulch also got min-maxed into misery for the solo player. First up, you could straight up pre-made a 10-man group into Warsong Gulch, but what if you ran into another pre-made? That's going to be an uphill battle. Remember, we want honor points, not PvP. So what players did is have a scout as part of their group join the battleground and see what the enemy team was made up of. If the scoreboard showed loads of enemies from the same realm, you kind of know already that it's a pre-made. And Horde at this point still had queues, remember, they couldn't do this unless they wanted to get back in line after abandoning the BG. So Alliance players would drop the queue, they'd get a new scout in, the old one would have the deserter debuff as they did leave a battleground. The rest of the raid wouldn't get any deserter debuff of course because they never actually joined the battleground. They queue again until they get a bunch of solo players where they can quite happily farm them until the victims realize it's not worth resurrecting anymore, and the optimal way to play the game is to semi-AFK as a ghost until they cap the 3rd flag. Oh, also Warsong Gulch had no in-game timer, they can go on forever. Some games were held hostage for literally over 12 hours. And there used to be exit portals inside Warsong Gulch too. They're the buildings kind of behind where the graveyards are, if you know what I mean. These were removed too as people were mind controlling enemy faction members and running them out of the battleground. This actually worked and it gave them a deserter debuff, which is kind of funny, but that's how Classic works sometimes. In time though, the Gen 1, yes they called themselves that, rankers hit 14 and things gradually began to get a little less sweaty overall. Classic does get a bit of a reputation for having people who take things to a pretty extreme degree when they just don't even remotely require it. I think WoW buffs were a good example of that when it came to raiding. Ranking, however, was one of those occasions where the players were very much in control of the levels of sweat that would be required, and they absolutely maxed that stat out. It was up to your server to determine the honor caps, how willing to group you were in order to earn honor, and how many hours you could run down Altaric Valley or run over unorganized pugs in Warsong Gulch and later Arathi Basin. And that's why the launch of the honor and ranking system in Phase 2 of Classic was and always will be the two sweatiest gamer months this game will ever see. For some, this will have been a trip down memory lane. For others, probably a feeling of relief that you didn't go full in on vanilla PvP ranking. It was certainly something, and I heard many times that after hitting rank 14, after literally months of playing all day every day with the same people, it was a bit of a strange feeling that eventually it had come to an end. But what ranking was memorable, and it created stories. Vanilla, for all its flaws, has always been very good at doing this, and that's why to this day people look back to how WoW started fondly. Classic WoW was a time when things were simpler, leveling was a journey, gear upgrades were a bigger deal, and everything took a bit more time, leading to that much more satisfaction when you crossed the next big hurdle. Everything was just right. Or was it? Recently on the channel, we've talked about some of the more memorable things in Classic, such as the opening of AQ40 or the PvP system, and today I thought it might be fun to remember some of the more, how can I put it, painful things about this version of the game. Stuff you can look back at and say, oh yeah, that was the thing, wasn't it? And don't get me wrong, each of these in their own way added to the game and made it what it was, and some people will prefer Classic because of these gameplay differences, not in spite of them. Classic had so many unique, fun interactions and features which set it apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, but on the other hand, it could certainly create scenarios that brought out the worst in people, or just naturally seemed to cause problems. Between loot, PvP, guilds, and player-made drama, this has to be the worst of Classic WoW. So let's see, where can we start on things from Classic which were more than just a bit inconvenient? How about this little addition called spell batching, a phrase that will cause nightmares for even the most dedicated Classic player. This was a feature that was brought back to WoW Classic right at its inception. The idea behind it was to handle server-side resolution of spells more closely to what would have been the case in actual vanilla, therefore creating a more faithful representation of the game and emulating it as if we all had really bad internet. Instead of the server handling each spell the moment they were fired off, it would instead do them in batches, hence the name spell batching. This batch occurred every 400 milliseconds, so in other words, the game was running as if you were on 400 ping all of the time. Now, the positive upside of this, if you can call it that, is that certain spell interactions present in vanilla would be there in Classic, such as two mages polymorphing each other at the same time, or two warriors charging each other, and just a whole host of other random weird interactions. In reality, looking back, it was bad, like really bad. The warrior mains out there will remember pressing execute, having your rage bar go to 0, and then the mob dies before the spell is processed on the batch window and you do no damage. The same with taunting mobs, it was just very slow. Playing Alliance at the time, it was not uncommon to throw Blessing of Protection on someone and another paladin would do the same, and they would end up with several forbearance at the same time. And of course, everyone's blessing went on cooldown too. But the worst experience had to be for healers. You just couldn't reliably play a clutch healer. The amount of times I pressed lay on hands or went to heal somebody, went to 0 mana and the spell never landed and they died was just so many, and it was so frustrating. This was the same experience for any healer. Finally, in patch 1.13.7, which was a few months after Next Remus came out in Classic, more or less in preparation for TBC by this point in time, Blizzard changed the spell batching formula, moving it from a forced 400 milliseconds to resolving as fast as it could, or by at least 10 milliseconds. Even for the seasonal servers for Classic, Blizzard decided not to bring this interaction back. Either way, spell batching was certainly an experience, and just thankfully not one we have to deal with anymore. Here's another lovely feature of Classic, which I'm more than glad is in the past: debuff caps. So you know how in Wrath and, well, in TBC for that matter, you just used all of your abilities, your damage over time effects and so on that your class had access to? Well, in Classic, you couldn't. Anything that went above the cap would push off an older and often more valuable debuff from a boss. They were categorized too into major debuffs such as Sunder Armor. These were the big actively applied ones that benefited the whole raid. Medium, such as Corruption from Warlocks. These are often actively applied but only a personal DPS gain. And minor debuffs such as Deep Wounds, which were passively applied DPS gains. In original vanilla, the debuff cap was 8. Now, hypothetically, one Shadow Priest to DPS in any capacity needed at least 3 debuff slots, 4 if they wanted to use Vampiric Touch, and you could have up to 40 players in a raid. I think you can see how this had the potential to be a little bit problematic. Thankfully, in patch 1.7, that's ZG, Blizzard doubled the debuff cap up to 16, which was a lot more forgiving, and when we launched with Classic, we had this same level of cap in place. All of the same, it was not uncommon to have a raid sheet prior to even stepping into a 40-man raid with the debuffs which you are allowed to do. Let me tell you right now, Serpent Sting? Nope. Moonfire? No. Devouring Plague? No. Any minor damage over time effect? Basically no. Debuff slots were all taken up by the big effects that buff the whole raid, not personal DPS gains. Eventually, Blizzard raised the debuff cap to 44 TBC, which functionally removed it, and then went on to literally remove it for Wrath. But yeah, in vanilla, you really weren't able to make the most of your class's full toolkit just because of this limitation. Speaking of debuff caps, why not move on to class balance, a term that I use very loosely for Classic, because it wasn't balanced at all, not even remotely close, in fact. I suppose this is a side effect of releasing on last patch and then not changing classes at all ever afterwards, but there was such a big difference between the top and bottom damage dealers in Classic. Here, for example, is the last 2 weeks of 90th percentile passes for Wrath Classic. There's definitely some winners in this list, and it's important to realise there will always be winners, but the majority of classes at least have one fairly solid specialisation, and if we scroll down and look at the number of passes per class and specialisation too, I think there's a good overall representation. People are playing a bit of everything, and the majority of classes are seeing value. Here's 2 weeks of Nax 40 back in Classics, 90th percentile passes again. A bit of a different story, isn't it? With one class being so clearly ahead, you'd wonder why on earth anyone would play anything else. And looking at the volume of passes per class and spec, it's a similar story too. For every Shaman DPS, Druid DPS, Priest DPS, and Paladin DPS, that's nearly half the classes in the game by the way, there were nearly 15 warrior DPS. I don't think people were playing Classic for its stellar reputation for class balance, but looking back, I've never seen such a clear divide between the top and the bottom. But now we have our force lag, our inability to cast spells because our raid leader won't let you, and a class that's literally doing about 1/3 of the damage of the warrior that dinged last week. We now need to pick up some sweet loot so we can press Starfire rank 5 for about 40 seconds before going Fortunately, you don't have to wait till level cap for problems on loot. No, the developers have put a lot of thought into this. You'll be getting a first-hand experience on how loot will go the moment you accept that one quest in the Barrens that has you collect Zevra hooves from the apparently unhooved Zevras in the area. It's common for Classic, just because you can see the item you need on the ground doesn't mean it's gonna drop. I mean, looking back at this quest, there's comments back from original vanilla on how bad the drop rate was. Here's another good one, this one's for the Alliance, Farron's Proof. You know the quest in South Shore that has you go collect Murloc heads from nearby? This one always feels like more of a grind than it should be. Oh, and how about Fiery Blaze Enchantments? That quest in the Badlands where you have to kill the whelps and drakes over on the east side of the zone for the heart. I remember very well spending nearly 45 minutes on this once, and I just eventually didn't leave until I got the drop. But eventually you get through questing and hit level cap. Now this is where the real loot drama begins. I mean, where do we even start here? The infamous hunter memes from back in the day where they would roll on anything and everything because, I mean, hunters could equip practically anything and everything, bar plate armor and maces for some reason. In practice for Classic, it wasn't the hunters that wanted everything, it was warriors. Leather for DPS, plate for tank, resistance sets for certain fights, physical mitigation sets for others, you need your PvP set, one-handed weapons for fury, two-handed for arms, shield for tanking. Oh, and that healer gear? Yep, believe it or not, I also need that for my diamond flask snapshot. A warrior could legitimately have dozens and dozens of items in their bag and find a use for all of them. And that is kind of cool actually. But what about the fact your raid had 40 people and bosses dropped a handful of items, half of which were comically bad had and were literally on permanent disenchant status. Oh boy, another shadow strike. Straight into the bin where it belongs. In fact, most classes wanted the same items too. There were just so many pieces which stood out clearly above others. Mage Blade, Talisman of Ephemeral Power, Quick Strike Ring, Onslaught Girdle, to name just a few from Molten Core alone. And every guild had an item that just didn't drop for you. I'm not even talking about bindings here either. I think between Blackwing Lair launch and AQ40 doing 2 raids a week, the guild I was with at the time saw a grand total of 2 mind-quickening gems. Every single mage wanted this item for PvP and PvE. It was so good it was still used in TBC. On the other hand, I believe we saw about 7 chromatically tempered swords in a row, which led to a lot of happy warriors and rogues about that bit of RNG. And not getting the item you want to drop is definitely still a thing in Wrath for sure. Malagos just refuses to drop anything which isn't absolutely garbage, but when you have 40 players, it's just a little bit more noticeable as all. Oh, and final point on loot, in case you had forgotten, vanilla had no tier tokens either, so you knew when you killed Rag or Nefarian or any end boss, they always dropped some nice druid tier for you, and the one druid in your raid got kitted out super fast. Next, something I actually quite enjoyed. So for learning professions beyond Journeyman, you had to go to a specific trainer somewhere in the world. Now, some of them weren't too badly placed. Expert Enchanting for Horde, for example, was in the Stone Talon Mountains, and for Alliance it was just outside of Stormwind. For the most part, it was a quick Google, and it takes a couple of minutes to get wherever you need to be. There was one big exception for a trainer who was just so far away from anything else that it was kinda just annoying to have to go there. Do you remember where you needed to go to train Artisan Enchanting? Keep in mind that during Wrath you can just train new profession skill-ups from any trainer. In Classic though, you had to go find Anora, who is of course located in the Badlands, just outside of the entrance to Uldum, as in she's inside of the dungeon exterior, but not in the actual dungeon of Uldum itself, if that makes sense. I guess back in the day this was found and shared by complete luck, but you clear this random pack of scorpions and she will appear just behind you. This kind of made it somewhat inconvenient to do on a lower level, though you did have to be at least level 35 to advance to the artisan level of a profession, but otherwise you had to go and fight your way through to get to this point. And unless you had prepared materials to level up as you were there, you were gonna need to make multiple trips here too. I mean, I get it, having trainers out in the world who are the only ones to advance you to the highest tier of a profession is cool and all, but Anora, could you just, you know, leave the Scorpion Pit when we find you for the first time maybe? Would that make sense at all? Let's move on though, because as things tend to be, the real worst stuff wasn't just the minor inconveniences of the game or things taking a little longer than maybe they could have. The real best of Classic, and often the worst, were the people on the server where you were playing. Now, people definitely bang on about server reputation and community back from vanilla, and I think mileage on that statement varies a lot from realm to realm, but what was true for certain is that other players could have a much greater degree of impact on other people's games. For the better, or in many cases, the worse. When the PvP system released in Classic WoW without battlegrounds present, players took to farming honor from lower level characters out in the world, and on some servers even resorted to ganking inside of the opposite faction's capital cities because of how fast player numbers dropped in response to the relentless ganking. And when battlegrounds were released, they wouldn't even prove a reprieve, as pre-mades of fully geared and prepared players would crush pugs in a matter of minutes to min-max their honor gains. And don't even get me started on how CC chains worked in vanilla. What are they capped at now, about 8 or 10 seconds maximum thereabouts? Well, in vanilla, sometimes you get hit by a polymorph and you just sat there doing nothing for 30 seconds straight, and then it gets recast again and you're sitting there for another 10 seconds. You can see why caps eventually got put on these things. Being CC'd for as long as a trash mob isn't too fun on the receiving end. But the cause of often the most drama had to be from world buffs. I'm not going to go over all the effort it took to assemble them here. I did do a video on it a little while ago though, so you can check that out if you wanted some more info. Suffice to say, raiding as a whole was shaped around collecting these buffs that made you do a ton more damage. And for the majority of Classic, you really did have to play around them. During the final patch, the same one as where they removed spell batching, Blizzard would go to introduce the Chronoboon Displacer. This would absorb your world buffs, pausing their timers and storing them to use at a later date. This meant you could you know, play your class up until raid time, not have to worry about people who would hide characters around the world and try and dispel your buffs. More worrying is that people spent their time doing this, to be honest, and have everything ready for raiding when you stepped inside of an instance. When I think about this and look back to world buffs, it makes me realize I really don't miss them. Not only due to the whole factor of having to go and collect them, but what they meant for raiding. You can't have a decent progression fight alongside players potentially being 30% more or less powerful, and as great as the Chronoboon was, it wouldn't change that either. Still, this is something, one of many things, which sets Classic apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, and many players do prefer this version of raiding, or at least a version of raiding with the Chronoboon Displacer. Who knows, maybe Season of Mastery 2 will answer this demand. There are even a few more things I could have covered here. The one-button rotations, Biss from world bosses and having to camp them, the list very much could go on. And despite all this, despite it being called the worst of Classic, I still like Vanilla as a game a lot. It definitely has a ton of janky things, which by modern standards just wouldn't work in other games, let's be honest. But it's also proven to be a little more than just a bit of nostalgia. There's something in Classic which realizes that maybe it's not always correct to sacrifice something that's good to try and make it perfect. One thing that made vanilla World of Warcraft stand out across all versions of the game ever is how the world was built and their content was designed. It wasn't this meticulous, thoroughly tested and balanced world. It was much more akin to a bunch of developers having the chance to do something with a cool, brand new world with limitless opportunities. And when you take that world and bring it back over a decade later, it's amazing to see all the ways players have discovered to truly unearth every possible secret and all the ways they've optimized their characters. Take world buffs in Classic WoW for example. Kevin Jordan, one of the 3 original vanilla developers and class designer for vanilla, was once asked about them on stream, to which he replied simply with, "There was no oversight for it. It was just a bunch of dudes making content that was cool, and a bunch of people working independently putting in stuff like that because it was a cool way to reward you for a quest or an activity." And that's really part of the essence of vanilla, which made it something memorable, because there was a lot of cool things that some dude had put in the game. In fact, there were loads of them. So what happens when you have an entire world of random cool things then? Well, that is the subject for today's video. So be it a quest reward, a player discovery, or other, these are some of the weirdest ways players have discovered to optimize their characters in vanilla. So early on in the Barrens, Horde players will come across Camp Taraho. Seems like your fairly standard little outpost and quest hub, but there's an NPC here that can actually provide some useful buffs even for maximum level characters. Just inside the cage near the flight path is the Quillboar Mangletooth. Players can complete a quest for him, after which they'll have the chance to hand in blood shards, which are farmed from Quillboars out in the Barrens. You can do this in exchange for several different buffs. Now, most of these buffs are pretty small, 10 extra strength, agility, or intellect, and they're not half bad for the level you can get them at. But for some reason, 2 of these buffs are not just flat stats, they are percentages instead. These are the Spirit of the Wind for 10 blood shards. This provides a 30% increase to movement speed, which is undispellable. However, it does only last for 5 minutes, so uses are very niche, if any at all. More interestingly is Razor Hide for only 4 blood shards. Now, the tooltip here is your vanilla classic. It does something, but we're not going to tell you what it does. However, if you test it in-game or check online, the damage reflect is only a really small value, not worth mentioning. However, the bonus armor is 25%, and the buff lasts for 10 minutes. Now, 25% extra armor, I don't think I have to say, but it's a lot when we're talking about a geared warrior or a feral druid tank. In fact, even during Naxxramas progression, Horde guilds could take advantage of this short-term buff on the tanks during bosses which hit your tanks particularly hard, such as Patchwork for instance, making this a level 14 quest reward usable on some of the hardest raiding content in the game. How about we cover some more probably unintended buff uses in raiding? Another one that was pretty widely used was the fire resist buff available in Lower Blackrock Spire. So you're going to know that Blackrock Mountain houses Molten Core and plenty of other dungeons, meaning they're all fairly close together. And the last boss in Molten Core is of course Ragnaros. Now what Rag does is a ton of fire damage, and a lot of it is unavoidable fire damage, between Lava Splash for some random AoE and Wrath of Ragnaros, which has a nasty knockback on it, which can then even chain knock you into lava. It's a good idea to bring some fire resist resist to add a little bit of leeway where your gear may be lacking on those first few kills. Also definitely worth a mention, resistance stats in vanilla were very important on a number of bosses. The higher your resist stat went against a certain element, the higher percentage chance you had to reduce damage taken by a certain percentage, which all averaged out, and it scaled with how much resist gear you wore. But what if you could get a bunch of resistances for free, allowing you to keep on more combat effective gear? Well, you could. Inside of Lower Blackrock Spire were Scar Shield Spellbinders. Players found that you could mind control these mobs and then use their fire resist buff on others, adding a huge plus 81 fire resist buff to raid members, which would last for an entire hour. Adding on a fire resist totem or aura for an extra 60 would leave you around 141, which without any other resist going on would reduce damage taken on average by around 33%, which isn't half bad. Oh, and in case you're wondering how long it took to buff if you needed your entire raid to go into a dungeon, well, in Classic you could take 10 people into most dungeons. You could 10-man the dead mines if you really wanted to. Who knows, just Classic things. There were also some mobs in Eastern Plaguelands which did something quite similar called Scarlet Medics. However, their buff was for 1 hour of extra arcane resist, and a boss we needed tons of arcane resist just never cropped up in Classic. We had Rag that needed fire, Viscidus needed nature, Sapphiron needed frost, and so on. And if you ever did need this arcane resist buff, it would have been super easy to get, as these Scarlet Medics are just standing around in the open world. There was also a buff from Black Fathoms Deep, strangely enough. Now, I don't think many active raiders went out of their way to get this since, well, Black Fathoms Deep is really in the middle of nowhere, and this buff is right at the end of the dungeon. But you can click an orb called the Altar of the Deeps after the last boss and gain a small 1 hour buff that gives you some extra intellect, spirit, and 15 extra frost spell damage. Mages were actually playing frost early on during Classic in Molten Core and Blackwing Lair because they're both full of bosses which were immune to fire, and 15 extra damage at that early stage of the game is not as bad as it sounds. Also, at the end of Black Fathoms Deep, there was this random NPC that would teleport Alliance players to Darnassus, and for Horde, it's Hearthstone or Walk. The final random buff I want to go over here came on quite late in the game when AQ40 was released. As part of a new World PvP event, random dusty red looking nobs would spawn out in Silithus. Players could click on these and carry them back to their nearby faction camp. When you were carrying them, you couldn't mount or gain any movement speed increases. I guess the overall idea here was for you to go and hunt down enemy faction players trying to turn in and steal them for yourselves. Anyways, once you successfully hand in, you'll get a buff called Traces of Silithus. This short 30-minute buff would provide a further 5% damage to melee and spell damage, which means, at least according to the tooltip, no buff for hunters as attack power was split into melee and ranged back then. Unfortunate. Oh, also fun fact, this buff was eventually banned on Warcraft logs for Classic due to the fact you'd have to get this buff last after all the others because it only lasts 30 minutes, whilst in a zone where you were auto-flagged for PvP on PvP servers and you couldn't mount. The griefers would have been out in full force to catch people out with world buffs there, so I think overall the idea was to save themselves a bit of sanity. Moving on though, quest rewards. This was peak random dudes doing some cool stuff design. Many of these items are just insanely overpowered despite being able to be farmed at a lower level. Many of these were even tradable for a time, though none of them were during Classic due to us playing on the final patch. Biggest of all is, so many of them were faction specific. I have 2 interesting ones for the Horde and 2 for the Alliance. Horde first. We need to start off with a level 6 quest. A lot of these really weird items come from very low level content actually. This was available near the undead starting area in the town of Brill. The quest A New Plague had you go out and simply farm some fins from nearby murlocs. Upon handing in, you were given 5 slumber sand, which could be used to instantly put a target to sleep for up to 20 seconds. And of course this is Classic, so we don't have silly things like level restrictions. It worked on any player of any level, and of course getting a 20-second escape that's instant cast on a 1-minute cooldown, that's not half bad. But this was just a one-time quest for the Horde only. Or was it? Well, no, actually, anyone could go and farm these items. Dust Devils out in Westfall were fairly rare mobs that roamed around the zone, and they have a low chance to drop magic dust, which does the exact same thing. So if you really wanted some of this stuff for example, opening the chest in the middle of the Gurubashi arena, you very much could go and farm it. The other Horde quest reward I have in mind was from a level 5 quest called A Solvent Spirit from Senjin Village, just outside the Valley of Trials. This had you go and collect some items from nearby crawlers and Makura. The quest reward was 10 times really sticky glue, which instantly routed a target for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Just like the sand, pretty handy tool to have in your bag when you need to make a heroic play in the battleground or just outplay during a gang. But the items the Alliance got were arguably even better. Starting off in Goldshire, we have the quest Gold Dust Exchange. For this you need to, surprisingly, go and collect some gold dust from a nearby kobold mine, and this quest is available at level 4, mind you. The reward was a bag of marbles with 10 charges, of course it being on a 1-minute cooldown like everything else, and its effect was to reduce the target's chance to hit by 25%. These were tradable right up to the final patch of World of Warcraft, and I'm pretty sure they were made bind on pickup because of Naxxramas progression, and even in Classic some players save these for Nax, and that's because this 25% hit chance reduction effect, for some reason, worked on raid bosses. Old Wowhead had comments pointing out how good this would be on Mexna, for example. Imagine Web Spray having a 1 in 4 chance to miss you, or what about Patchwork progression? Cutting his hit chance down by that much is like giving your tank a huge mitigation boost. It was a truly unique and niche item, though it's pretty clear to see why it was eventually made bind on pickup. The final item is arguably the most single powerful one-use quest reward consumable which has ever been put in the game, and for once this isn't a super low-level quest, nor was this item ever tradable as far as I could tell. This was a reward from the level 25 quest Mage Summoner, and it gave the Light of a Loon, which is more or less a paladin bubble in a bottle. Any class in the game could go completely immune to all spells and effects for 10 seconds. To this day, some people still have this sitting in their bank, waiting for that time when they need to be the one person alive at the end of a raid encounter or to survive some impossible battle. Be careful when you use it though, this item only has 1 charge. Let's move on to some weird raid optimizations. So you'll probably remember back in Classic, Shaman was Horde only, Paladin was Alliance only, and that created some big differences in the raiding and PvP scenes. Horde had the terror of the Elemental Shaman globaling you in a battleground, as well as a nice easy ride on Viscidus thanks to Poison Cleansing Totem, whilst Alliance had tons of passive support tools from the Paladin, as well as a healer that once had late game gear quite literally could not go even if they tried. So Holy Paladins had this talent called Illumination, which made it so when their spells crit, they gain 100% of the base mana cost. Or in other words, the spell was free. This effect was so powerful, it got nerfed to 60% effectiveness in TBC and down to 30% in Wrath. You can already tell how busted it would have got late game. So whilst Alliance raids were able to go non-stop thanks to a never-ending supply of healing, Horde were not. Their counterpart Restoration Shamans didn't even have Water Shield back then. Due to this, Horde speedrunning guilds had to start getting pretty creative when it came to finding ways to keep themselves moving forwards in a race, and it was during the opening night of Naxxramas 40 in Classic where one such Horde guild on North America, Onslaught, showed exactly the extent that you could go with this. Consumable use has always been a talking point in Classic, and during this raid Onslaught went through, for example, 231 Greater Shadow Protection Potions, 170 Greater Frost Protection Potions, and 46 Flasks of the Titans. But most surprisingly was the fact the healer team overall used 133 Flasks of Distilled Wisdom. Now back in Classic, unlike Wrath of the Lich King, flasks were not cheap. Each needed around 40 herbs total, as well as a Black Lotus. These were rare spawns in high-level zones, so popping a flask really felt like a commitment. That being so, how did they go through 133 in one night if it's a 40-man raid? Well, you see, back in Classic, Distilled Wisdom didn't just increase your intellect as it did in TBC and beyond, it increased your maximum mana by 2000, as in if you were on 0 mana and you pop one of these flasks, you're now at 2000 mana. I think you can see where this is going by now. Players in these guild were chain popping flasks which could have easily cost around 150 to 200 gold worth of materials as if they were mana potions, and you could spam flasks. They had no cooldown other than the global one of course. And again, if you think 100 to 200 gold sounds expensive now, you probably want to count a good 8 to 10 times inflation between then in Nax 40 and now in Wrath of the Lich King Nax. Still, in the end, they got World, First, Horde, and Nax Rammers 40 for putting in this extra effort. And that out of raid preparation was really what classic speedruns were all about. It's stuff like this why people remember vanilla, and with today's far more min-maxy oriented MMO crowd, so much more of it has been uncovered. In World of Warcraft, be it retail or classic, there's a rather clear path of content that your character is supposed to go down. From that moment you enter the world as a fresh-faced adventurer, going on quests, doing dungeons, gaining XP, learning new abilities, and so on. Eventually you hit the level cap and have a wider array of options open up, such as PvP in the arena or PvE in raids. Aside from that, over the years WoW has fleshed out content with achievements, transmog collection, Mythic Plus, rated battlegrounds, pet battles, and tons more. But some players don't really care about all that. Some players don't need a guided path. Whilst World of Warcraft may be the classic theme park MMO where you come to try out all the set-piece content, some players treat it more like a sandbox. A world separate from their own where they're free to explore, experiment, and just play the way they want. Today I want to take a look at some of the most unique ways that players have created their own game within the game, and check out the people who are famous in World of Warcraft for how differently they played the game. Warriors in vanilla WoW have a reputation for being difficult to level. They are highly gear dependent, lack rage generation early, and are super reliant on a good weapon to really start putting out respectable damage. Anyone who has leveled a warrior has that moment where the odds stack up against you and you just straight up die to a mob the same level as you because they parry or dodge about 6 times in a row. It wouldn't be the warrior experience if this didn't happen now and again. But what if picking one of the toughest classes to level was not already enough for you? What if you wanted to abandon the one thing that warriors rely on so much and tried to hit level cap without ever having equipped any items at all? Well, on 13th of February 2007, a video was uploaded to YouTube showing an individual who had achieved just that. Gutsrot the Troll Warrior. The challenge was simple: level 60, no weapons, no armor, only grinding, with Gutrot claiming about a 6-month time frame to get this done. Also, I noticed this character was on Airy Peak. That's where I started playing WoW back then as well, and I was on there for years. I guess I just never came across this crazy troll in his leveling journey. Funnily enough, if there was a class to do this challenge on though, Troll Warrior is a very good pick. Trolls get extra damage against beasts, which you can use to grind on, regeneration for a bit of extra health, and berserking scaled with missing health back then. Certain key warrior abilities work well with this too. Thunderclap or Demo Shout both don't need a weapon of course, and in the Fury tree you have Enrage, Rampage becomes more useful in TBC, and Bloodthirst doesn't actually need a weapon to be equipped in order to be used. This video gained a bunch of attention for this player, with now many rooting for him to push through TBC content and hit level 70, though Gutrot started to provide more update videos showing just how brutal this challenge was. Especially entering Outland, the choice of mobs to farm were pretty thin, and for a time he even went back to farming old zones such as Silithus or questing in Western Plaguelands. But on October 22nd, 2007, near 8 months after the first upload, Gutrot released his grand finale, hitting level 70 in Senjin village, not far from where his journey began all that time ago. The final level was achieved by summoning an image of Archmage Vargoth to hand a quest in. This is usually part of a quest chain in Netherstorm, but I guess you can summon him anywhere. The gathering of trolls and supporters alike was so huge that the server even went offline for a brief time, something that in years to come Blizzard would start to take a bit more of an aggressive stance on. Gutrot and his crew would then go on to raid Stormwind and create a truly unforgettable night for all those involved, before leaving the video with a simple message: see ya in Northrend. The follow-up to this and his level 80 would take quite some time though, with a repost of his invitation to his level 80 ding being found on MMO Champion, dating September 16th, 2009. There is also footage of the pre-ding event online, but nothing from the famous troll himself. I think we can assume Gutrot did achieve his goal of hitting level 80 without weapons or armor, but also created a legacy for players to follow, to be insane enough to take on what he started all all those years ago. And during Vanilla Classic, a player would follow in Gutrot's footsteps called Voivod, who not only took on the naked leveling challenge, but did so as an undead, hardcore, no deaths warrior, which is like playing hard mode on mega hard mode. I guess you have cannibalized to regenerate every so often against humanoid or undead mobs, but I'd imagine you're not too short on spare change because this challenge involves a ton of grinding mobs. Either way, challenge runs such as this that began all those years ago are starting to see more popularity once again through the more recent hardcore movement on Classic WoW. We'll have to see how far people can take this insanity in the months and years to come. Next is a player who I can totally relate to from when I first started World of Warcraft, Dysphoria. This player was famous for their Hunter versus World videos, where they would take on high-level dungeons as a solo player, and just see if they could overcome the odds and beat content that was designed to be done with a full party. Hunters in WoW have always been known for their ability to solo content, with tons of ways of kiting enemies, long-ranged attacks, and a pet. They're kind of the perfect class for the job. I remember having a level 30-something Hunter, and the content I did was more or less exclusively working out how to solo various Scarlet Monastery dungeons. In some of Dysphoria's earliest videos, you can see them working on a route through Dire Maul North, using their pet to reset mobs and then quickly moving through the open spaces. They would gradually advance through feigned death use and even showed off a King Gordok strategy, which is more or less exactly how people mapped out the optimal way to defeat the boss in Classic, which is crazy. To think a player had cracked this all those years ago solo with way less information on the internet is very impressive. Now, if you played a Hunter at endgame during Classic, chances are you also did some Dire Maul North runs, and there are several reasons why. It's a personal gold farm, mainly from disenchanting items in the tribute chest. You could sell items in the tribute chest too, as a player who was not in the dungeon could zone in and loot them still, or to clear it so other people could enter and gain various tribute world buffs. And whilst a lot of the run has been sped up and smoothed out, you have to hand it to the Hunter that led the way to getting these tactics down. A more recent player now, but a super unique one, and one which I suspect you just may have heard of, Double Agent. So during the Cataclysm, one of the changes made to the game was now that gathering herbs or mining would give a small bit of experience. Just a little helping hand to ensure that whatever you're doing in World of Warcraft, it's helping you progress towards your level cap. Not a big deal, right? Well, in the following expansion, Mists of Pandaria, World of Warcraft's first and only neutral race was introduced to the game, the Pandaren. Starting on the Wandering Isle, this race sees the good and bad sides of both the Horde and Alliance, and at the end of their starter journey have to make a choice to commit to the faction that they prefer. Or that is what most people would do anyway. What if you decided that all this fighting just really wasn't for you, and you would rather just remain on the Wandering Isle? One player, named Double Agent, did just that. After exhausting the Isle of Quests, the only repeatable method of experience gain left was gathering herbs or mining, and that is just what he did, requiring thousands and thousands of herbs to continually level up. This incredible journey saw him start at level 1 all the way up to 85 during Mists of Pandaria. There are two more factors that make this achievement even more impressive, by the way. First of all, there were no mount trainers on the Isle. You were expected to do this on the mainland after having picked a faction, so Double Agent rolled a shaman in order to have access to Ghost Wolf, which would speed up this already lengthy process considerably. Second is that the Wandering Isle, back then at least, had no mailbox, and the heirloom tab didn't exist in the game until Warlords of Draenor, so we had to do this without heirlooms or a mount. And this is one of those rare occasions where the player has kept up his incredible feat of strength, tweeting in December 2022 that he had been able to achieve level 70, which is now the cap in Dragonflight, without ever having left the Wandering Isle, finishing with a playtime total of 212 days and 22 hours. Now that is dedication. Next up, there have been many players over the years who have dedicated their character to challenges forsaking the combat that World of Warcraft is often centered around. One of these is Nor or Rhynish. These were a gnome rogue and an undead priest. They were both role-played as characters that did not want to cause harm in any way and play through the game as a pacifist. As part of the challenge, they would try to keep weapon skills at 1. This was done through having a fishing pole equipped, as well as focusing on methods of experience gain that did not need combat, such as exploration, gathering quests, or retrieval quests. This was done early in TBC though, so eventually their possible XP gains did begin to plateau out towards the mid-20s on both characters. In 2.3, Blizzard released repeatable battleground quests, which technically gave this player a new avenue to continue gaining XP, where they would only heal on Priest, and on the Rogue they aim to disrupt enemy flag carriers through CC, or carry their own flag using non-damaging Rogue abilities, as well as equipping pieces of gear such as the Green Well Armor, which has a chance to sleep the target on hit. I wonder what the theoretical level cap with no combat would be in Classic or TBC. Everything is a lot more mathed out these days. Even still, I'm not sure this is an avenue in the game that's been fully explored. Maybe someone out there will try it one day. Till then, we have stories like this. Next up is one of those names you've almost certainly heard of at some point. It's one of World of Warcraft's most well-known players to represent a single class. I'm not sure what made them more famous, finding so many janky spell interactions, dedication to soloing content, or the fact that he was a troll when pretty much every other famous mage from back in the day was undead. I'm of course talking about Faxmonkey. Whilst hunters were good at soloing things, mages could often take it one step further, especially in vanilla with no AoE cap and elites which could often take out mages in a few hits. Faxmonkey showed how powerful Frost Mage kiting was back then, through repeatedly moving back and using Frost Nova, and just doing things which realistically very few players, let alone classes, would have been capable of doing at the time. Not to mention his one versus many PvP videos, which there's more than just a few amazing mages over the years who have been able to show just how overpowered this class really is in vanilla, or finding out that spell steal in TBC could lead to some pretty hilarious results, such as the fire shields that kobolds used in AV stacking with your spell power, which meant you could go grab a few buffs from the nearby kobolds in the mines and then just run around and microwave people. Seeing a mage just run straight into a whole pack of alliance and AoE them down in a matter of seconds, even when they're in ice block, will always be something that's memorable. There's been so many unique players and playstyles over the years that people have come up with to really push the boundaries of what both of themselves and their class are capable of. Whether it's a grind that lasts thousands of hours, soloing content, or role-playing in a certain way, it goes to show what MMOs are all about. It's that diversity of content, the ability to create your own story, and the chance to be a player who goes down in the history books of this game for making memories for so many others. Those are the few I wanted to cover today. Let me know which players have made an impression on you over the years, whether they were a big part of your server, you watched them on Warcraft movies, or anything else in between. Would love to hear about it. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.